Hi everybody, I'm Susan Mulvihill. Welcome back to our garden in Spokane, Washington. Our hardiness zone here is somewhere between 5B and 6A. Boy, have I got a great topic for you today. Fertilizers. What the different kinds are, what they do for our plants, when to use them, and so much more. Coming right up. All fertilizer packages have 3 numbers on them, but what do they mean and what do they do for your plants? The numbers on the packages represent the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium contained within the package of fertilizer. I also want to mention that potassium in some areas of the world is called potash. And an easy way to remember which is which is it's alphabetical: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. If you look at the label on this fertilizer, you'll notice that it has 3% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, and 6% potassium. So what do these nutrients do for our plants? Nitrogen promotes leafy green growth. Phosphorus helps plants bloom and set fruit, and it also helps with root development. Potassium helps plants grow, facilitates the movement of water throughout the plants, and it helps them fight off disease. So you can see all 3 of these nutrients are very important. When I start seeds indoors, I give the young seedlings a diluted liquid nitrogen fertilizer, such as Alaska fish fertilizer, once they have some true leaves. True leaves are the mature form of the leaves rather than the initial seed leaves you can see here that seedlings start out with. This fertilizer helps them get off to a great start. So when do I use it? I fertilize the seedlings about every 10 days to 2 weeks with this mixture, which, to clarify, is half as much fertilizer to the amount of water the label suggests. So instead of 2 tablespoons of fertilizer to a gallon of water, I use 1 tablespoon fertilizer to a gallon of water. When I transplant the seedlings out into the garden, I give them the full dose of nitrogen fertilizer at planting time and about 2 weeks later. Which types of vegetable plants benefit from nitrogen fertilizer? Here are a few examples. Arugula, broccoli, cabbage, kale, lettuce, spinach, Swiss chard. So think about it. All of the crops that I just mentioned, with the exception of broccoli, are ones that you're growing for the leaves so you can harvest and eat them. So that means they need a nitrogen fertilizer. Now, broccoli has very tasty leaves, but of course we're also harvesting those wonderful heads. I mean, that's the main point of broccoli, right? But the plants do not need to bloom and set fruit. So while we're on the subject of nitrogen, I did want to bring up the issue of using animal manures in your garden. They are a good source of nitrogen. It's important to use composted or aged manure. But the other thing I wanted to let you in on is that if you use horse or cattle manure, it can potentially contain a persistent herbicide that does not break down as it goes through their digestive tract. And if you add in that manure to your garden, it will impact the garden adversely for several years, and that is not good. So I do recommend going with manures that are from smaller animals, so chickens, rabbits, possibly goats. Phosphorus is a nutrient that does so much for our plants. It benefits plants that will bloom and produce fruits for you. Examples include tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, melons, summer and winter squash, and pumpkins. I have to tell you that I get a lot of emails from gardeners who are really frustrated with their tomato plants. They'll say, my plants look great, they're beautiful, lush, green, looking wonderful, but they're not blooming, they're not giving me any tomatoes, but I fertilize them all the time. And so of course I ask nicely, what kind of fertilizer are you using? And invariably the answer comes back, nitrogen fertilizer. And I totally get that, and this is something we all have to learn over the years with experience, but that nitrogen is not doing anything for blooming or setting fruit. It's only making the plants look lush and beautiful. So phosphorus is what things like tomatoes and melons and peppers and so on require in order to produce for you. What else will phosphorus do for your plants? It will benefit crops that need to form large roots. So examples would be beets, carrots, parsnips, radishes, rutabagas, and turnips. That's because phosphorus aids in root development. I want to also add that I do not give nitrogen to root crops such as carrots and parsnips, and that's because that excess nitrogen will cause the roots to fork and split. You don't want that to happen. One of my favorite organic sources for phosphorus is bone meal. And you can see this particular package is of fish bone meal, which is just a variation on it, but equally good. It's super easy to find at garden centers. Just sprinkle it onto the plant bed at the rate on the package and gently fork it in a little bit. I only do one application of bone meal before I plant my root crops or the crops that will be flowering and fruiting. You can see in this package of fertilizer that there is 6% potassium or potash in the container. As I mentioned earlier, potassium or potash does a lot for plants, but I specifically concentrate on nitrogen and phosphorus when I'm shopping for fertilizers. Potassium is generally included in most types of fertilizers, and that is sufficient for my garden. What about micronutrients? So I'm talking about things like copper, boron, calcium, and magnesium. All of these things will typically already be in your soil, and it's the microorganisms within the soil that will help make those nutrients available to your plants. So I just wanted to mention this because there are different types of micronutrients that you can purchase at the store. For example, I have a box here of azomite that is a source of potassium or potash. But generally speaking, if you take good care of your soil, those micronutrients should be in there already, doing good things for your plants. Now, should you buy organic or non-organic fertilizers? You probably already know I'm going to say organic, but let me explain why this is important. With the non-organic fertilizers, they contain large amounts of nutrients that the plants are not able to take up. So a lot of times that just goes down into the groundwater. That's not good. With the organic fertilizers, they contain smaller amounts of diverse nutrients that give your plants their best growth. So if you can go organic, I encourage you to do so. And the great news is that organic products are so much easier to find at garden centers, home centers, hardware stores, and so on. I mentioned earlier when I fertilize my seedlings, but what about fertilizing your vegetable crops in general? Prior to planting everything, I prepare the beds by adding some compost and fertilizer to the soil. For root crops, the only fertilizer I use is bone meal prior to planting their seeds. Most crops don't need additional feedings, but I fertilize heavy feeders like tomatoes, peppers, and corn about once a month during the growing season. If it's early in the season and your soil temperature is below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, It's important to know that the microorganisms are not very active yet, and so they're not really making those nutrients in the soil available to the plants. So if your plants look a little funky, maybe a little pale, that is why. It's the temperature. If you ever hear the term balanced fertilizer, that means a fertilizer that contains equal proportions of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. A lot of times what you'll see on the label is 5-5-5, 10-10-10, something like that. So that's all it means. We gardeners are a generous lot. A lot of times we'll read the package directions for fertilizer and it'll say to use 1 cup. And so we immediately think, well, gee, if 1 cup is good, 2 cups must be even better. That is totally a waste of your money and not a good idea. Fertilizer companies are required to put on their package directions the minimum amount of product you need in order to accomplish whatever the goal was. So follow the label directions. More is not better. Okay, I hope this video took some of the mystery out of using fertilizers in your garden. Thanks so much for watching today, everybody. Happy gardening.